Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Glenn Diesen. He's a Norwegian political scientist, professor at the University of Southeast Norway, and a geopolitical analyst. We're going to discuss his upcoming book, which is, if I'm not mistaken, it's going to be available in the markets in February. The title of the book is The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order. Dr. Glenn Diesen, thank you so much for being my guest on Syriana Analysis. Your name was mentioned multiple times when I was doing the live streaming, and there was a special request to host you on my channel. So it's a really pleasure and honor to have you on my channel.
Oh, thank you so much for the invitation. And yes, good to hear.
If I'm not mistaken, the book is coming next month, right? In February.
Yes, on the 15th of February.
Great. Guys, since we're watching this live streaming, when you're watching this live stream, the links for pre-order of the book is in the description below. You can check it on Amazon in the United States and in Germany, and you can also order from your local stores online. Dr. Diesen, your book, The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order, which will be available, as we already said, in February, as the military situation in Ukraine is characterized by Western officials by, quote, stalemate. What motivated you to start writing the book when the entire Western pundits and think tanks were confident in February 2022 that Ukraine will eventually win this war? And we were speaking about a decisive war against Russia.
Well, the narrative was quite false from the start. And I think that was quite obvious for anyone who was following the details. But, this is what happens in times of conflict. You exaggerate, for example, the losses of your adversary, and you ignore the losses on your own side, and you try to skew the narrative, to mobilize support effectively, portraying everything as a fight of good versus evil. This is not unique. This happens in all countries. The problem is you often see then journalists and academic, they become, information warriors. They have to pick our side. And if you pick our side, then you have to repeat the same talking points, even if you have an objective reality which can be proven to be otherwise. So this creates, this makes it quite problematic. But I wanted to write not just about the war, the direction it took, which I found the narrative was quite dishonest from the first day, actually, literally the first day. But then I wanted to also write about the wider implications, because this war, in my opinion, reflects a wider competition for world order. This is something I've heard from Russian officials speaking, but also the Americans and the Europeans. They all recognize the wider significance. So this is also something that I've been writing about, been coming for a while. I mean, first book was 7 years ago when I wrote about Russia and China creating a greater Eurasia, and either we can resolve our differences through diplomacy, or it will end up in war. So given that diplomacy didn't work, war had to happen sooner or later from that perspective.
Yeah. The title of your book is The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order, which indicates that the world is heading to a multipolar Eurasian world order. For the rival powers, why is Eurasia holds particularly important place among the geopolitical theorists and decision makers in Washington, D.C., in Moscow, and in Beijing? And how can we define a Eurasian world order?
Well, Eurasia always had a central role in for the Americans and then the British before them, because we always had, since the Peace of Westphalia, we always had more or less a balance of power. That was the structure of the world order. But we've always had the British and then the Americans kind of using this to a balance of power among the continental powers in Europe and Eurasia in order to have the dominance as a maritime power. So both the British and the Americans refer to this as offshore balancing. That is, the British and Americans would join the big wars late, and then when the other countries had bled themselves dry, and then come in late in the war and then effectively impose a balance of power in which no one country could dominate. So this has been quite consistent through both British and American strategies. So the main idea is the maritime power, which can dominate this huge Eurasian continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific. You can dominate as long as the other powers are divided. So historically, the British were quite focused on making sure there's a division between for example, the Russians and the Germans in Europe, because if these continental powers come together, that would undermine the leadership of the British and then the Americans. Now, this also applies to the wider Eurasia. So you want to keep the Russians apart from the Chinese. You want to keep the Chinese away from the Iranians. You want to keep the Turks away from the Russians. So again, it's not very original, but this is, divide and conquer. This is how a maritime power pursues hegemony. So my argument is simply that a Eurasian world order, it functions differently. So, for example, in the past, of course, in the 19th and 20th century, the Russians could aspire for hegemony. They neither have the capabilities or intention to do so now. What you see is many countries would like to have Eurasian integration to deprive the maritime power, which is the US, of hegemony. Now, what you see is the Chinese would like to have Eurasian integration, like bring these countries together in terms of industries, transportation corridors, financial instruments. But in order to do so, they need the cooperation with the Russians. Now, the Russians have slightly different formats for Eurasia, much like the Indians, much like the Iranians. But they all have to cooperate because no one can advance their idea of Eurasia without the others. So while the maritime powers often then have an incentive to pursue division, you see now the Eurasian powers having an incentive to promote cooperation. Just as a brief detour, for example, the Chinese, you saw when they enter Eurasia, they want to integrate closer with Iran, but they don't want to alienate the Saudis. So they have an incentive to create a peace agreement between the Saudis and Iranians. So this is a Eurasian power. Now, in contrast, the maritime power, which is the United States, their power derives from alliance systems in peacetime. That is, stoke conflicts between them. Then the Saudis are dependent on America for security, and collectively they can weaken the Iranians. So again, this is how the different interests works. Of course, there's more to it in the book, though.
Yeah, you mentioned the divide and conquer strategy, and I've been speaking about this, for example, in the Middle East and also in Europe. But there need to be a readiness in certain countries with the local players to accept this strategy and to pursue this or adopt it, right? For example, in the Middle East nowadays, we can see increasing number of countries such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE. They refuse to continue in this traditional policy of the Americans in the region in antagonizing the Iranian side, for example, and they're striking better relationship with Iran. And now the Chinese are coming and jumping the wagon and presenting themselves as a mediator between the Iranians and the Saudis. So the tensions are decreasing in the region and not increasing. If we put the Gaza war aside now, which is again a direct intervention by the Americans and the Brits again bombing Yemen and trying to steer the flares of the war in the Gaza Strip. But in the case of Germany, for example, there is a very clear strategy by the Americans, especially after World War II, and which was represented by the first chief of NATO, that they have to keep the Germans and the Russians separated from each other. So my question here would be, why there are so many elements in Germany refuse to see this fact that if Germany and Russia come closer together, then the European continent will live a peace, stability, and better prosperity for them. Why do they accept to adopt the divide and conquer strategy? Is it because of the liberal democratic system in these countries?
Well, I think part of it's ideology. That is, the whole generation now after the Cold War, they've been they raised pretty much on this idea of liberal hegemony, in which we think we transcended history. That is, there will be the perpetual leadership of the collective West under liberal ideals, and this, this whole Fukuyama idea of the end of history. This is where they believe to be. But this is, of course, very this is the ideological element. But Germany is quite unique, though, because when they began to rebuild after the Second World War, the rise of Germany very explicitly was seen that it could only be acceptable if it was built on two pillars of European integration. That is, through the European Union, they had to dress themselves in the European clothing if they were going to be powerful. And also the second was NATO. So having the Americans on the continent, which also relaxes the other Europeans. So this is, I think this is somewhat more unique to the Germans. Obviously, there's a recent article actually out by the former finance minister of Greece, where he even talked to an American, well, the leading American officer for Europe, NATO. And he said, what are your objectives in Europe? What is the objective of NATO? And he still says, keep America in, the Russians out, and the Germans
Yes.
down. This was the first stated mission of NATO as well after it was founded. So they know that the objective is, prevent Germany from taking too assertive role. But again, I think they were hoping, the Germans, that over time the Europeans will become, through collective bargaining power, have a equal status as the United States, and then you will have the collective hegemony on the West. But that's not going to work.
Yeah. Another attempt for a divide and conquer strategy is happening at the current moment in Ukraine, and this is the topic of your book. You characterize the Ukraine war by, quote, a proxy war. In the online world, some say, quote, Ukraine is fighting for its own survival backed by NATO powers, while others say Ukraine is a proxy for NATO and doing the bid of the latter against Russia. But don't you think the truth is somewhere in the middle, that in some of the aspects Ukraine is being used as a proxy, but at the same time Ukrainians themselves see themselves fighting for their survival against Russia?
Oh, definitely. No, I well, now they're in the war. At the end of this war, there might not even be a Ukraine. So there's no question, about that they are in an existential war as well. So this is, one doesn't want to deprive the Ukrainians of complete agency either. But it's worth noting that, first of all, the leading Americans are also calling this a proxy war, and Ukraine itself. The reason why I call it a proxy war is this war, to a large extent, well, it did start in 2014, and this was and over again there has not been a support from the majority of Ukrainians for the path that was chosen for them. But obviously it has several dimensions. One shouldn't oversimplify. So, but Ukraine has always been very divided. But it's just, I just want to point out, when Ukraine was offered NATO membership in 2008, it's worth pointing out that from 91 to 2014, only 20% of Ukrainians wanted to join NATO. 1 month before they were offered future membership in 2008, you had almost 45% seeing NATO as a threat, and only 15% associated it with protection. Meanwhile, half the population meant it was much more important to have relations with Russia. So, so it was quite significant that the drive for NATO membership, while we've been trying to portray it as something, we have to help the Ukrainians get away from the Russians. Ukraine was not Poland. They did not want to be rescued from Russia. And this is why, in 2014, the coup, it also did not have support from the majority of Ukrainians. This is, but it's often lost in the narrative, because we always say we helped the Ukrainians, but we toppled their democratically elected government unconstitutionally and without the majority support. Even the majority of Ukrainians didn't even support the Maidan riots, even less supported the coup. So I think, coup. Proxy war is quite correct, especially if you see the government which the US put in place after 2014.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, even the new government after the coup, and they followed the impeachment procedure, and it wasn't met all the conditions of an impeachment of the former president, right? So the governments that followed the coup do not enjoy legitimacy in front of the constitution of Ukraine itself.
No, and that's also why it's not a controversial issue, because the Ukrainian constitution is it's right there and written, and it didn't meet the conditions. The British tried at one point to say that it was removed within the bounds of the constitution, but that was proven that's not correct. You can very easily see the votes which were required, and then we say, well, he fled the country. What can we do? Yeah, because we're going to kill him. This is a coup. So. It's George Freeman, he called this the most overt coup in modern history, and I tend to agree with that.
Yeah, if we take a few steps back, your book explored the Western-centric world. Can you please tell us more about it? When was the rise of the Western-centric world, and what were the foundations of this Western-centric world that prevailed for quite some time?
Well, I would say it's been going on for 500 years, because when we talk about world order, it has two components. It's, well, a world
Mhm.
order is the rules we live with, and it tends to be determined by two aspects. One would be the international distribution of power, and the second would be the legitimacy to rule, or the rules that are being made. Now, I would say that the beginning of when the West began to take a lead, effectively, well, if you're going to talk about a world order, the world has to be connected, and it was
Yeah.
the Europeans who began to connect the world during the age of exploration. That was, in 1492, Columbus crossed the Atlantic. 1498, you have Vasco da Gama, circling Africa, reaching India. These are the two key events when they
Yeah.
effectively established control over international maritime corridors. But then also power signified not only by controlling the world seas and connecting the world, but also with the military and economic dominance. So you saw then, especially from the Industrial Revolution, the Western powers beginning really to dominate. And then, of course, financial power as well, where you see, banks, currencies. So this is kind of the key power which was established, and we can say that the world order has always been Europe centric, because the modern world order, we can say, was established in 1648 at the Peace of Westphalia. It was a
Westphalia.
European order, but because the Europeans dominated the world, it effectively laid the format or formula for world order, except Europeans had full sovereignty, the rest of the world did not. And again, this is also what part of the rules, and
Yeah.
and this is what legitimacy of it was contested.
Yeah, can we combine between the Western-centric world order that you were speaking about and the liberal hegemony? Are they did they advance and develop in parallel, or they are two different parallels?
Well, when you have a hegemony and you dominate, who has sovereignty? In other words, what states can enjoy full sovereignty?
Hmm.
This will always be limited, because on a hegemonic system, why would you accept equal sovereignty for those who are not equal to you in
Hmm.
power? So you create then a system and rules based on, creating a legitimacy for the for this hegemonic system. Now, what's quite unique in liberal imperialism, which is something Adam Smith all the way back commented on, was if you see that the world is built around universal ideals, universal values, and path to modernity, and you say we are the champions of liberalism, now you create a system of advanced civilizations and weak ones. So this is
Yes.
originally we focused on development. So who's the most developed? We have like not just a right to dominate the weaker one, but we have a responsibility to do so. And this is
Hmm.
when we have the civilizing missions. So, you have civilized people, and then you have the barbaric ones. And the civilized should have full sovereignty, the barbarics should not have. Uh, and then, of course, this form of focus on development after especially the Second World War, and then especially after the Cold War, when we have the liberal hegemony of the United States, this was translated more into human rights and democracy. So what we're saying now is, if you have human rights and democracy, like perfect, if you will, or like Western, then you qualify for sovereignty. If you don't, then the West has both the right and the responsibility to intervene. And this is where everyone's probably familiar with the rhetoric of the garden and the jungle.
Yeah.
This came under the colonial times. So the civilized people are belonging to garden, and it's the right and the duty to cultivate the jungle. And
Yeah.
this same rhetoric now we see with under liberal hegemony, when the United States, as well as leader of the European Union, Borrell, Joseph Borrell, go out and say, listen, we are a garden. We have to go into the jungle before the jungle invades us. So it's the same kind of logic which applies.
Can we put the Afghanistan war, for example, the Iraq war, and there were so many interventions and attempts for coup d'états in the Middle East, especially in the past 2-3 decades, in the context that the United States wanted to improve its situation as a liberal hegemon around the world, because they wanted to instill these so-called values of democracy, human rights in these countries. And how do you see the failure of the United States? Like, is it an intentional failure? Did they just fail because they couldn't implement these values in Iraq and in Afghanistan, or they didn't have the intention to begin with?
Well, this was also something one discovered in the 19th century is that the countries who attempted to civilize the barbaric ones, be it the British in India, they didn't only have the goal of advancing the rule of law, they also pillaged all the resources. And this is also how you see liberal hegemony working. That is, it provides legitimacy for undermining the sovereignty of other states. But at the end of the day, the top priority will always be resources and strategic advantage. Obviously, you have people in the United States who are quite ideologically committed to the idea that we're going to go in and spread democracy and advance human rights. But it's always natural resources and strategic interests that pretty much will come first. And
Yeah.
I think, obviously, they didn't go into Iraq because of weapons of mass destruction. They knew that wasn't correct. And then afterwards, when that didn't work, they kind of fell back on, we're going to develop democracy then as a fallback option to provide legitimacy. And again, this is also what drained away at the power of the United States, because once you have an empire, not only do you exhaust your material resources in terms of their military and their social structure at home, but they also drain the legitimacy because look over the past 30 years, the legitimacy of the United States to rule the world. In the 90s, people were overly supportive of America almost around the world. Today, they're seen, almost as this evil empire. So
Yeah. I'm asking this question because I remember in 2003 when they were invading Iraq, and all this talk about bringing democracy to the Middle East, and also they threatened Syria with intervention after 2003 war. And we see that these ideologues that you are talking in Washington, D.C. are few of them, especially among the neocons, are now preaching about what's happening in Palestine, and they say that there has to be some sort of an Armageddon. There should be a bloodshed so that the second coming of the Messiah will be fulfilled, etc., etc. So why I'm asking this question, that do they really believe that they are here to as a power to spread these values, or it's just a tool to embolden and improve the position of the United States as a hegemon? And from your answer, I understand that those are the selling points in front of the people and in front of the public opinion, that they have to go to these countries to first make the savages civilized in front of the people, of course. And in our countries, because we have lived under, let's say, some sort of authoritarian regimes in the past few decades. So the people were looking forward to the United States, that we will become like the United States if we adopt this ruling system, or if we become more democratized. And this was the gate that the Americans were able to penetrate the Middle East and North Africa after the Arab Spring, right? And because of the failure of this, we see nowadays the liberal hegemony of the United States is in a decline mode.
no, definitely, and well, that's why I said it's not a uniform group, but overarching is to provide legitimacy for it. But it's also good. It's also a good selling point for legitimacy for if you want to partner up with local actors, be it within Syria or look in Iraq. The Kurds, they kind of believed in this idea that the Americans are coming here and they just want to fight for our freedom. This is not how the world works, but it also is good for creating consensus in the United States, because there you have some hardcore, militarist neocons who aspire for this American century and empire, and then suddenly they go find this soft liberal-hearted ones who just say they want to spread values and democracy and believing in rule of law, and then they effectively come together in terms of this military interventionism. But obviously, the common denominator is always interest. I mean, look at Saudi Arabia. They do not have a better human rights record than Iran. But the reason why you pick on one and not the other is because one aligned itself with America and the other one did not. So it becomes an instrument often to undermine the sovereignty of other states.
Yeah.
It's also,
You put extensive focus on Ukraine in your book. Of course, this is the topic of today's discussion. But since you mentioned Syria, has the Syrian war played any essential role in the decline of the liberal hegemony, as the U.S. regime change war in the military aspect failed in Syria?
I would say definitely. Especially when the Russians intervened in 2015, it's the Americans kind of lost control over that entire civil war as well, or proxy war, because it's been one failure after another, and it goes back to some of this liberal delusion as well, that the United States somehow has this moral authority and greatness to resolve every issue around the world. So this has been a long strain of failed forever wars, from Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, one after another. Effectively, just bogging themselves down, fighting what are weaker adversaries. But now, they're shifting though into more. After you have a revival of great powers, now they're going after large powers, be it not just Iran but Russia, China. So
yeah, it's very risky. One of the conclusions and arguments of your book is that while the emergence of the Eurasian World Order intensified after the Ukraine war, we are entering a turbulent times because a Westphalian system has not yet asserted itself. What do you mean by that? How are we going to a turbulent times, and how the Westphalian system has not yet asserted itself? Do you expect that the Westphalian type of system would be asserted in the future?
Yeah, well, I think that the rules of the international system have to reflect reality, and the reality is the international distribution of power. Now, this is already multipolar. If you look at economic power, military, the United States can't dominate the world anymore, and I think this was quite evident in Ukraine, because a unipolar system in which there's no dominant, which there's one dominant and there's no other poles of power. Russians kind of proved this isn't the case, because if a great power should be able to resist some of the fiercest efforts by the leading power to take it down. And look what the United States and all its NATO allies did. They sent all their weapons into Ukraine in order to defeat the Russians. They put all the sanctions in the world on Russia. They tried to mobilize the international community against Russia, and they failed on all counts. And there's the reason why I say that the Eurasian World Order has intensified was because many countries are now very worried that they're also affected by the sanctions, secondary sanctions, the way the NATO countries effectively stole the funds of the Russian central bank. I mean, even countries like India, which is a friendly of the United States, are now beginning to diversify their supply chains. They're reducing the role of the dollar. They're using different payment systems. So they're already preparing themselves for a unipolar system. And as I forgot his name. Anyways, there's a good point that the rest of the world doesn't necessarily cheer for Russia, defeating Ukraine. Like, they haven't even supported the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But the reason why many haven't joined condemning Russia or sanctioning Russia, that means the world outside NATO, is because they don't support NATO's proxy war against Russia, which began in 2014. They see this as making the world quite intolerable. If the West was able to break Russia, this would be another effort to restore U.S. hegemony. And sorry for a little detour, but my point is, if you have a unipolar system, one center of power creating legitimacy for ruling the world with sovereign inequality, and on the other side you have a multipolar system, which everyone should have sovereign equality. At the moment, the Americans kind of they lost the reality of unipolarity, but they're still holding on to it. They're trying to defeat the Chinese with economic wars. They're trying to defeat Russia through Ukraine since 2014. They want to break Iran, so they're looking to destroy other poles of power and restore hegemony. Meanwhile, the other large powers, including friends of America from Turkey to India, they would like to see a multipolar system emerge. So at the moment, we're pulling the world in two different directions, and this is why we have chaos. We can't even agree on basic things. What is the rules of the international system? The Russians, Chinese, or the rest of the world outside NATO are talking about international law. NATO, they're talking about the rules-based international order, which is not international law in any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, what proves your argument is why the United States is targeting the three countries, Iran, Russia, and China, together nowadays, is that they represent the three pillars of the Eurasian area. And once these three countries come together, the Eurasian region will be I'm not going to use the term strong, but they will be unified through trade and economic relationship, which will establish trust between each other, which will lead to different security architecture. And this is why also the United States doesn't want for Russia and Germany to deal between each other a lot in terms of the trade, because trade establishes again trust, and trust establishes security, and there will no more be a need for NATO in Europe. But in the Ukraine war has emboldened many countries to pursue or diversify their relationship between the East and the West, between NATO and between Russia, and the countries who were traditional allies of the United States. For example, Saudi Arabia. Who would have expected for Saudi Arabia in the height at the height of the war in Ukraine to reject demands by Joe Biden to whether increase or decrease the production of the oil, etc., etc. But in your argument that you're making, which is brilliant, that this Ukraine war has opened the gate for regional countries and upper regional countries or below regional countries to have more periphery to maneuver and pursue their national interests, compared in the past when they were probably terrified, because the United States was an absolute superpower, and the United States was able to project its power within the countries in Saudi Arabia or in other countries. And we've seen examples: Saddam Hussein, Assad almost got murdered, Gaddafi, which was again murdered, and other presidents and other leaders were overthrown after the so-called Arab Spring. So some of the countries in the Middle East argue and say, for example, the Saudis, when I speak to my Saudi colleagues, they say, you in Syria, you're not as smart as we are. And I'm like, how do you explain that? He says, the United States is a superpower. We don't want to challenge the United States when they were at the peak of their power. But you guys did, and your country is destroyed. And now we find an opportunity through the gate of the Ukraine war that the Russians and the Chinese are coming closer. And now we have an opportunity, these countries, to bring uh, Iran into the BRICS, into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and therefore, when these three countries establish friendly relationship, and now they are trying to establish a pact between Russia and Iran as well, this will bring Saudi Arabia and open an opportunity for Saudi Arabia to diversify its relationship. So the Ukraine war seems like the key that opened lots of opportunities to countries to join different groupings, economic blocs, and also security architecture, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that this is also what's often not understood in the West, because whenever we talk about Turkeys, we will always ask, oh, are they going to go to Russia, or are they going to stay with us? And then you look at Saudis, oh, they're going to go to the Chinese, or they're going to stay with us. But, they're not a colonial possession. And you have to understand these countries it's also not the Cold War. They're not looking which bloc to join. And that's the thing. If you look at the Chinese and Russians, they're not promoting exclusive blocs. They want to get with the Saudis, but also Iran. They want to have good relations with all the actors in the region. And if you look at the Turks, well, they're not looking which bloc to join. They want to they maximize their benefit by diversifying their partnerships. They want to keep good relations with the US, the Europeans, but also reach out to the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, and get along with all the countries in the region. Because once you lock yourself into one, or once you accept these peacetime alliances, you isolate yourself from other centers of power, and you develop excessive dependence on a power which is stronger than you, which is the United States. Now they can dominate you. And so what's interesting now that this multipolar system is emerging, the Saudis, the Turks, Indians, everyone is jumping on board. Everyone is seeking to diversify their ties, except one region, and that's the Europeans. And in Europe, they see the exact opposite. The Americans tell them, cut yourself off Russian energy. And we do so. Then, now say you have to cut yourself off. The Chinese are also bad. We have to cut ourselves off Chinese technologies. Okay, do that as well. So you see Europe not just weakening itself and deindustrializing, but it only has one major partner left then, which is the United States. And if you have this partnership, economic interdependence, which is asymmetrical, that is, Europe is much more dependent on US than US is on Europe, Now, from asymmetrical economic interdependence, you can extract a lot of political influence. So Europeans are now becoming so politically dependent on the US, and the ambitions for strategic autonomy or political, they call it European sovereignty, it's long gone. And
Yeah.
this is because they boxed themselves in. They should have done the exact opposite. They should have reached out to Russia, China, India, Iran, try to set up proper relations with all of them, but they let themselves bully by the United States. And now, as Macron would say, they're vassals of America.
But Hungary didn't join this wagon of becoming one bloc against Russia. I mean, they are still buying gas from Russia. And the other day, I saw a report on a German TV outlet, and they were fear mongering against the Chinese electric cars in Hungary, and how the Chinese electric cars are invading. This is the term that they use, the Hungarian markets. Whereas, like, I mean, in a free market system, you would compete against the Chinese, but they don't want to compete against the Chinese. They want to have a monopoly over the markets. And this is not how the free market works. And therefore, countries nowadays, such as Hungary, Serbia, I mean, relatively, uh, they see through these manipulations, but there are other political elites in Germany, in France. I am sure that they know about these cases, but despite that, their hands are tied. I don't know what's happening, but they have become, as you mentioned, completely dependent on the Americans, and this is asymmetrical because the Europeans need the Americans more than the Americans need the Europeans. In Chapter 7, you argue that between 1991 and 2014, Ukraine became quote a pawn and a center of a proxy conflict between a liberal hegemony and the Westphalian world order. You say Ukraine is a divided country in a divided Europe. Eventually, Western Ukrainians sided with the West and East Ukrainians sided with the Russians and preserved the quote fraternal bond. What are the historic bases of this division in Ukraine? Is it ethnic, religious, ideological, or it's the one of the consequences of World War II?
Yeah, maybe all of the above. I think it's just a population which has a different origin. You have to see how the country was made up as well. So, for example, a territory from Odessa to Kharkov, effectively what the Russians had their eyes on. This is, historical Russian cities, Russian territories, which was incorporated into into Ukraine. Now, effectively, they have a very different, they have a different historical memory as well. So in Western Ukraine, they tend to view, how do you view this thousands of years of common history with the Russians? They tend to see this as being history of Russian imperialism. But then if you went to Eastern Ukraine, they saw this as well. We're effectively be one people. We've been living in the same state for centuries. So again, when you have this close relations with another nation, it becomes a double-edged sword because, and I can sympathize with the aspect that it would undermine your claim often to sovereignty, because if you are one people, why do you have a separate state? And so for the people in West Ukraine, they would like to assert their independence and liberate themselves from the history with Russia. In the eastern part, they want to form effectively a common to work together with Russia, and they see themselves as being indistinguishable. So they often see themselves as the opposite, because if you want to promote nationhood in Western Ukraine, then you have to de-Russify, cut all ties with Russia. But if you come from Eastern Ukraine and you see Ukraine is a country with two ethnicities, two languages, two cultures, then this ethno-nationalism from the West is a huge threat to you. And this is why, look at the way they commemorate World War II, for example. In Western Ukraine, you have a lot of these fascist groups. They make, Bandera, who worked with Hitler, a national hero now. They after the coup of 2014, they name streets after him. In Eastern Ukraine, they commemorate, they celebrate the victory of the Soviets over Nazi Germany. So there's a lot of tensions. Now, what they had in common were both sides had an interest in developing its independence as a state, which means to have an independent national, distinctive national identity from Russia, but not anti-Russian. And they were on the path to develop this. That the problem is, not only is Ukraine divided, but they could have managed this on their own. But then externally, they're also in a divided Europe, because we decided after the Cold War we're gonna redivide Europe, and Ukraine has to choose side. Well, what do you do then?
Yeah.
In the West, we have an incentive. We have to join the Western Ukrainians, which is why we aligned with fascist groups as well. And we want to de-Russify,
Yeah.
reduce the Russian culture, marginalize the Russian-friendly politicians, and make it a front line against the Russians.
Yeah.
And this is kind of the source of the conflict.
Guys, while you're watching this live streaming, just for you to know, many of you just joined in the middle or in the quarter of this live streaming. The links for to pre-order the book, The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order, which will be in the markets in mid of February, is in the description below. You can pre-order them from the United States and from Germany. And also, if you could hit the like button so that more people can see, so that we can navigate through the algorithm of YouTube. Doctor, you in chapter 9, you explored the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. You argued that NATO was reluctant to prevent the war and sabotage the peace negotiations in March, April 2022 because its objective was, quote, to weaken Russia as a strategic rival and send a clear signal to China to bring new energy to liberal hegemony. Now, the US attitude was at the first 1.5 year of the Ukraine war, we will support Ukraine as long as it takes. But now they say we will support Ukraine as long as we can. Has the US underestimated Russia's strength? Because clearly the latter outperformed NATO's powers militarily and economically.
Yeah, well, I think they bought into some of their own propaganda because, and again, this is one of us to follow what happened only in the first week of the war because, the main narrative is that Russians went in to invade all of Ukraine. The Ukrainians fought back, and they were starting to beat the Russians. This showed how weak Russia was. So now we're going to defeat them. But that's you can track what happened, and objectively, it's not even close to what happened. Instead, we see that the Russians invaded on the 24th of February in 2022. And, they were very explicit. This was because the West sabotaged the Minsk peace agreement for 7 years by the admission, by the way, of Angela Merkel and Hollande as well, who negotiated this agreement. They said it was to buy time to arm Ukraine. So because of this, they invade. And so what would be the Russian motivation then? They want to impose a peace agreement which is favorable to Russia because Minsk didn't move anywhere. The West just used this to pump more and more weapons in. So Russia invades then with 150,000 soldiers. I think less than 100,000 actually enters Ukraine. And as the Russian American military experts have already declared that the military tactic had nothing to do with conquering Ukraine. It didn't make any sense. You can't conquer a country with this. Instead, the agenda was to keep Ukraine outside NATO, to impose a political settlement. And what would be the evidence? Well, the first day after the war, on the 25th of February, Zelensky confirms. He says, "We heard today from Moscow, they still want to talk." On the first day after the invasion, they would like to talk about Ukraine's neutral status. That was their argument. And then the day after, that on the 26th of February, they confirm, listen, if Russia wants to talk to us about neutrality, then we're not worried about this. And they confirm we will have now talks with Russia. That's on the 27th of February, the third day after the invasion. No preconditions, the Ukrainians say.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, on the American side, on the same timeline, you see on the 25th of February, they say, yes, the Russians have reached out to the Ukrainians on the first day to talk peace, but we reject it completely. Not without preconditions. They have to pull out all their troops of Ukraine before we will allow diplomacy to begin. Even when diplomacy actually started to begin, the same American spokesperson, Ned Price, was asked, "Do you support these negotiations?" No, he says, because this is not about Ukraine. This is wider. This is effectively about world order. We have to make Russia pay. And some people have described this as a myth, but you have to keep in mind there's been two negotiators who were trying to get Ukraine and Russia to talk. It was Turkey and then Israel. And they both have the exact same account. That is the former Israeli Prime Minister Bennett, as well as the Turkish negotiators. They said the same thing. They were close to a deal. They had everything agreed. The most important thing was neutrality. That's what the Russian wanted. The Ukrainians were willing to give it in return for Russia pulling out. And they both said the same thing, that that the Americans didn't want it. The Americans and British, they saw this as an opportunity. Now they can weaken a strategic rival, much like, for example, China through economic coercion. Now they can kill the Russians and weaken Russia, and they don't even have to use their own soldiers. They can just fight with the Ukrainians. So it's a great deal. Even Harald Kujat is the general from the German Bundeswehr. He was also head of a NATO, what's it called? Committee. He also said the same thing. Yeah, listen, they had a deal until Boris Johnson, on behalf of the Americans, came and gave a clear argument to the Ukrainians. He said, listen, we're not going to support any peace. If you sign this with Russia, you're on your own. However, if you will fight them and kill some Russians, we'll give you all the weapons you need until you win. This was what they said. Reported in, again, confirmed by the Israelis, the Turks, popped up in the Ukrainian media, and even key, like, huge Russophobes in America, Fiona Hill and Angela Stent, they write in Foreign Affairs, like the biggest journal they have in the US, that this is what they wanted. The Russians were willing to compromise on everything except neutrality for Ukraine. They couldn't join NATO. That was the main thing the Russians wanted. And this is Russians were willing to make a deal on everything else. And so even by the Americans' own account, this whole idea that that this had nothing to do with NATO, you can't negotiate with the Russians, war is the only option, it's all nonsense. It is all the evidence is out there, and it's on black and white, and proves otherwise. It's just pure narrative, and we're not able to discuss it. Anyone who contests it say, "Listen, this is a proxy war." Well, now you're excusing Russia's invasion. You are legitimizing the war. Now you have to be cancelled.
This is I totally understand that. I mean, Russia now intervened militarily. They call it a special military offensive, and they want to neutralize Ukraine. They don't want Ukraine to become a NATO member on the borders with Russia. But now we have Finland is joining NATO, and it has a long border again with Russia. So this is also a backlash against Russia, right? More countries are spending money on their arms and their industries here in the armed industries in Europe. The United States is encouraging Finland, Sweden, Germany to increase their expenditure over their militaries. I mean, against who are these militaries are directed at the end of the day, right? They are NATO countries. So Russia, I mean, they probably won in terms of blocking the accession of Ukraine to NATO, but they're losing other countries in the region, like Finland.
Yeah, and well, again, I think that's a shame, because Finland was one of the great success stories for neutrality, and instead now they made themselves into the largest front line against Russia. So I think this will have consequences later. You can't help but avoid that this will increase tensions. So it's quite unfortunate that it went that direction, especially because no one in Finland suggests that Russia will invade or anything.
Yeah.
I think Russia will end up in many ways. This will hurt Russia as well. They lost a lot of men. They will have more aggressive NATO now, more military budgets. More members in opening a northern Scandinavian flank against them. So this is very negative. So of course, I think if it was up to the Russians, if they invade or not, they wouldn't want to invade, but they were never really offered, to be honest, maintaining the status quo. Since 2014, the coup, every year they began to more and more purge anything of Russian-friendly politicians in Ukraine. They purged all the Russian-friendly media. They purged the Russian culture, and every year more and more weapons were pouring into to Ukraine. So they saw themselves as not having much of an option. Now, that's not even my word. In December of 2021, the former analyst at the CIA, George Beebe, I think is pronounced, he wrote that, reaching a very critical point, because now the United States is entrenching itself so hard in Ukraine. Now the presence becoming more and more dominant. They're refurnishing all of the ports and modernizing the ports in Ukraine to fit American warships. If the Russians wait another 5 years, we'll have so much weapons in Ukraine. It will be an American frontline. The risk of Russia not invading now is becoming greater than the risk of invading is becoming greater than the risk of not invading. This was effectively the argument. So again, this is why one provokes a war. If you make war a better option than because the changing status quo is not acceptable. So
Yeah.
so again, this idea that it wasn't provoked is quite ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, based on your realistic analysis, I cannot see the situation now in Ukraine, but with a pessimistic lens, because from what you said, I don't see that there is a hope for a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia in the foreseeable future, unless Trump comes to power. Is that something that could change?
I don't know. I think Trump is a bit of a wild card. Sometimes I do get the impression doesn't matter who sits on the throne in Washington. Nothing changed under Trump. I mean, he was
Mm.
very hostile to Russia as well. So it's put rhetoric aside. What did he do? So I don't think it matters much. But I think there's no incentives for NATO to strike a deal with Russia. They want their European security agreement that
Mm.
based on existing agreements, by the way, which
Yeah.
is that they shouldn't expand their security at the expense of Russia. We shouldn't
Mm.
have dividing lines, this kind of things. But again, in NATO, we're fighting with Ukrainians. Why? There's very little cost. So where's the incentive? If we were fighting with our own soldiers, we would have sat down and tried to find an agreement long time ago, I think. But
Yeah.
but as the Americans, again, not my words, as American leaders keep saying over and over again, this is a great deal for us. Lindsey Graham, they continue. They will promise to fight to the last man if we send them weapons. This is
Yeah.
perfect. You have
He
you
said
have
this is the best money. He said this is the best money that they invested. They're killing Russians.
killing Russians and not losing any of their own people. And of course, he's a bit of a war hawk. But you see this. Even the defense minister Lloyd Austin, he said, "Listen, we want to see Russia weakened severely, and this is the path to take." The spokesperson of when Boris Johnson was prime minister said, "Listen, the only thing acceptable outcome here now is for the Putin regime to fall." The British Minister of the Armed Forces as well said, "Listen, we have to make sure the Russians have a complete fiasco, that it is such a mess that the people will get rid of Putin." Hillary Clinton said, "Listen, we have to make Ukraine into a new Afghanistan." They wouldn't make their own country in Afghanistan, of course.
Yeah.
I think Dan Crenshaw is a senator. He said, "Listen, to invest in killing the enemy without losing a single American soldier is a great idea." Mitch
Yeah.
McConnell as well. I think you paraphrased him here, which was no, sorry, Mitt Romney.
Killing.
Mitt Romney saying, "Yeah, this is we get to weaken the Russian military, not lose an American soldier." And the Republican leader, Mitch McConnell, he had this argument as well. "Listen, we have to support Ukrainians, but let not get lost in this ideology of this very charismatic Zelensky. At the end of the day, we are here to defeat and weaken Russia. This is our cold, hard, practical interest. It's not about saving Ukraine." So they keep saying it over and over and over again that we are now using the Ukrainians. Even the Poles, the biggest friends of the Ukrainians, they had the president going to the Americans, trying to encourage them to send more weapons, saying, "Listen, this is our opportunity to weaken Russia. When else will we be able to fight with other people's soldiers?"
Yeah.
This just over and over again, and it's still it doesn't even allow to enter the narrative in the West now. It's quite strange.
Yeah, I think it's also very sad to see the people, the ordinary people, falling for similar propaganda over and over again. There are people in Syria who believed in the American dream of bringing democracy in Iraq. There were people in Ukraine. Similarly, many people bought into these narratives of the Americans, and there is no counter narratives that are effective for the people to get motivated not to accept the American model. I mean, nowadays you see what's happening in Armenia. It's heartbreaking for me to see that Armenia is becoming another pawn for NATO, doing the bidding of the United States in Southern Caucasus. And this the repetition of the similar mistakes by leaders, but also people who believe into these narratives, right? And here, Dr. Diesen, I want to ask you the final question. You say a traumatic experience is awaiting the West as it adjusts to a multipolar world. However, it doesn't appear that the US will accept a peaceful transition. What are your predictions given the current onslaught on Gaza, which left the US and its so called values and rules naked in front of the world?
Well, as we began discussing, in world order, it's not just the power you have, which is already declining, but it's also the legitimacy to use this. And the U.S. Legitimacy to use, to have an empire effectively has diminished quite rapidly. And I think that what's happening in Gaza is quite dramatic because, they're now effectively supporting a genocide. And you see the same from the European Union for that sake. They spent so many years promoting themselves as a normative power. Didn't use or rely on traditional power. They were going to just change norms and values. They're now saying, we stand by Israel in this through thick and thin. We're geopolitical power now. So I think that all of this is weakening a lot of the American legitimacy for the entire wielding the dominant power they have, which is declining as well quite rapidly. So I think that it's a unique situation in history, because in Europe we had multipolarity before. We had it before World War II. After World War II, we had bipolar, so the Soviets and the Americans, and then after Cold War, we had the unipolar, only one central power. But what we never had was a multipolar system in which the other poles of power were not Europeans, because now we have a multipolar system emerging, and the most advanced and leading power will be China, a non-Western states. This is a huge shock to the whole system. First of all, not only do the collective West, lose this dominant position, but also the whole legitimacy of the rules, the way we view ourselves, because this has often been based largely on what they discussed in the 19th century about the liberal empire, which is we're the most advanced in civilization. It's our right and responsibility to lead other countries forward. A lot of this legitimacy is collapsing now. People looking to, again, China as a leading economy. China is the one advancing peace. It's, building hospitals while the Americans are bombing them. This is there's a huge shock coming to the system. And this is what also NATO is very worried about, which is why they're willing now to fight really to, at least to the last Ukrainian, if not join the war themselves.
Yeah. Dr. Glenn Diesen, thank you so much for joining Syriana Analysis today and sharing your valuable insight about your book and also the analysis that you presented. I was now reading some of the comments. People were very satisfied by the solid arguments that you made. Guys, if you want to pre-order the book, The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order, I put the links in the description below. And also, if you like to support my independent work, you can become a patron. The link is scrolling on the screen right now. But Dr. Glenn Diesen, I'm very grateful that you dedicated your time and your insights for me. And I learned a lot from you and also for the audience of Syriana Analysis. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Anytime.